All right, so this chapter is on risk assessment. And basically, we're going to talk about what a risk assessment is, and then some of the vulnerability and security tools that go around with that. Basically, you need to understand the differences in qualitative and quantitative risk assessments, and understand how to look at those vulnerabilities. And we will touch on how to do a penetration test. That's where you're actively testing a system. Now that really gets more into the CEH class, but at this level you need to know about it and know what it is. We'll talk a lot, pardon me, about some of the common tools like network mappers. Nmap is one you're going to hear now and you're going to see over and over. Analyzers and sniffers like Wireshark, and some of the password crackers that, the brute force ones and others like CowPatty and some of those. So basically, risk management is the identification, assessment, and prioritization of risks, and then the mitigating and monitoring of those risks. This is also called information assurance. Some of you, if you go on into, into graduate programs, you may have an entire class on IA, on information assurance. But the whole idea is the management of risk. Anytime you take a system and put it on a network, just by adding it to that network, you introduce risk. It is unavoidable risk. The game in information technology and in security is making the risk as minimal as you can, but still having access to the system. In one of my classes, I once heard one of the professors say the only truly secure system is one that you turn off, put in a vault, and bury at the bottom of the ocean. And there's some truth to that. That's a fairly secure system. But what's the usability of that system? It's pretty much zero because, it's turned off and buried. This is where the juggling act comes in. You want the system to be usable, but you've got to deal with security. Now, there are really only a few things you can do with risk. You can transfer it, you can avoid it, you can reduce it, or you can just accept that it's there. Transferring to another party is usually meant by insurance policies. If you think about this from a non-IT standpoint, you have an insurance policy for your car. You're driving and you hit somebody. You transferred that risk of you hitting somebody because your insurance company will pay it if it happens. Avoiding the risk, in information technology, that means that we don't do whatever it is. We close the ports that those are accessed with or whatever. Reducing, we do things to our data to reduce those risks. An example of that might be SSL certificates, our encryption of some kind. Locking a server room could be a reduction of risk, just keeping things secure. And then finally, we have to accept some or all of the consequences of a risk. By putting a system on the internet, again, if I have an outward-facing web page, there is some risk that will get hacked. That is unavoidable if I want that site to be available. I can do all of these things to make it as minimal as possible, but there's always going to be a chance of risk that I have to accept because that system's available. And then residual risk is just left over after a plan has been implemented. So basically, risk assessments follow this general order. First, you're going to identify the organization's assets. And with this, it's important to know an asset is a lot like what we would say is an object in Active Directory. You generally think of an asset as a thing, but it could also be a person or a room or an item, whatever it is that we're trying to protect. These are our assets. We then want to identify the vulnerabilities with those assets. If my asset's a database, okay, what are some of the vulnerabilities of that database? Is it, have I sanitized my data? Is it where SQL injection work? Whatever. Identify the threats and the threat likelihood. How important do you think this data is going to be to somebody else? If you are, mom and pop grocery store down here on the corner, how much risk do you think them getting in and finding out how many bananas you currently have in the store is? Just as a crazy example. Is that something that is worth it for them to get into? I usually use my home network as an example on this one. I don't have a huge amount of security on my system at home. Other than just a decent WPA2 password, I don't have a lot set up. If they get into my network at home, they're not going to get anything, so it's not that big a deal. And then what is the potential monetary impact? If this happens, what's it going to cost me? And based on what kind of company I am, that should be a big piece of this. You know, I'll go back to the example I've used for y'all before. If I'm Coca-Cola and my recipe gets out, that's a much bigger deal than if it's something that people already know. So what you do is build a risk register or a risk log, and this will help you track issues and problems as they occur. So the two main types are a qualitative and a quantitative risk assessment. Basically, a qualitative is looking at how a system can impact it on a network, and you're not really looking at money or at numbers with this. This is an easier way to do it, but you're not assigning a value. Each of these really have their pluses and their minuses. Quantitative, on the other hand, is honestly what business likes to see more of, because when you start dealing with risk and with managers and things, especially unless you're at a very large company, you're probably going to work somewhere that you have managers that aren't IT people. And people who aren't IT people, what they're going to speak is money. You know, tell me what this is going to cost and what's it going to cost if this gets out. Those are things they're looking for. So in quantitative, you look at some things like single loss expectancy, the annualized rate of occurrence, and the annualized loss expectancy. And you get your loss expectancy by multiplying SLE and ARR, your single loss, and your annualized rate of occurrence together. All right, so once you get ready to do your security analysis, you're either going to do an active or a passive security analysis. You're probably going to do a little bit of both. Active is a hands-on test where you're actually running it against the system in question. In CH, we talk about this as the active session, the active part of a penetration test. This normally will start setting off alarms. If they've got a good, IDS system in place, they're going to see that you're actively looking at their network. So normally what you do before you do that is you're going to do something passive, some kind of passive reconnaissance. And this is where you're looking at the traffic, but you're not generating any traffic on your own. Lots of, beginning security analysis will do passive for quite a while, where you're just kind of looking at things on the network, you're looking at data. Like in here, if this lab were our target and you knew the lab was open, and you knew that the first port on our switch over there is a mirror port, which it is, you could plug into that mirror port and you could start a passive analysis just by sniffing the traffic for a little while. That would give you some data like what are the MAC addresses in here that are in use, what are the IP addresses, some pieces of things you could start getting information about. Once you do that, then the next thing you normally do is called a fingerprint. Fingerprinting a system is where you run something to tell you what it's running. Nmap, which is by far one of the most common products used for this, Nmap will do a fingerprint with a -O on the command line. And it will tell you with a pretty good degree of accuracy what operating system it thinks it's running. Now, why might you want to know what operating system something's running? Exactly. Different OSs are going to have different vulnerabilities. If my target is that machine back there, that Mac, but I'm not in the room, all I know is the IP address. I don't know that it's a Mac. I don't know it's Windows. I know nothing about it. I do a fingerprint on it and figure out that it's a Mac, then I can start looking for vulnerabilities in OS X versus if I run a Windows vulnerability on it, that's nothing's going to happen. And then up until recently, one of the Mac vulnerabilities most of y'all may know about is where you could actually hit, I don't remember what the key was, but there's a keystroke and you could log in as root without a password, which, root on a Linux system or on an Apple system gives you basically the keys to the kingdom. There have been vulnerabilities like that in Windows as well. I'm not just picking on Mac. But knowing the operating system tells you where to start. All right, so that brings us to security controls. And a control is just something that you are doing to make a risk different. We've got management, operational, and technical. And then the definitive security controls Preventative, detective, and corrective. I think those kind of will probably make sense to you without a lot of explaining. Preventative is something to stop something from happening. If I close a port, that's a preventative control. I don't want you to get into a web server. I close port 80 on the web server. You can't get into it. A detective control is like an IDS system. I'm running something that's going to show me that you've connected, or that you're doing something. Corrective, on the other hand, might be like an IPS system where I detect it and then I do something to shut it down. Different systems, again, will have different things. And I'll go back to an example that I'm pretty sure I've told y'all. Again, I get y'all and CH confused a lot, but Visa is my favorite example of a lot of this. Shutting down the network, even though that might prevent data from getting out, think about the money Visa would lose if they couldn't take credit cards for even 5 minutes. Just imagine if, thank God they have plenty of redundant systems, but let's, for the sake of argument, say they didn't, and Visa's entire network went down for 1 hour. Imagine the shaking of confidence of people not being able to use a credit card for an hour, and imagine the money they'd lose over that 2% fee they're not going to get because people can't use their cards. So one of the other pieces of this is a vulnerability management. And this is the practice of finding and mitigating vulnerabilities in computers and networks. Normally, this is done with 5 basic steps. You want to have a desired state of security. How secure are you going to make this system? And that's going to depend, again, on a lot of things. How much money do you have to spend on it? And what is the data worth? Then you're going to do baselines. With everything in networking and in security, baselines are so important. You need to know where things are, so if something's weird, you know what it is. You know that it stuck out. Most places then have to prioritize their vulnerabilities. It would be great if you could, if the world were a Sims game and you could just pull money out of the sky. But you can't. Companies are only going to have so much money to spend on something. So what are the most important vulnerabilities to them based on that information? Then mitigate those vulnerabilities. Do what you can to stop those vulnerabilities from happening. And finally, monitor the environment. Keep an eye on things. You've got your baseline now. If something's sticking out, you'll know what it is. So some of the tools to do this, again, a network mapper. Nmap is by far one of the best ones. If you are interested in it, I make you do this in the CH class, but I'm going to suggest you all do it. Download a program called ZenMap. Z-E-N-M-A-P. There's a version that runs on Windows. That is a graphical interface for Nmap, for the scanner. Put it on your laptop, and when you're at home, just run a quick scan on your home network. See what you see. It'll kind of tell you a lot of things about it. Vulnerability scanners. Metasploit is a good one here. They make tools that will look for vulnerabilities. Ping scanners, just scanning the network, seeing what's open. A protocol analyzer. Wireshark is by far the biggest of those. And I've mentioned it before, but play around with Wireshark. It's a really powerful tool. And then password crackers. Again, if you are doing a vulnerability assessment and you're able to gather some of this information about a system, I know that your password is exactly 8 characters. Okay, then I've got some information. I can start running a password cracker. Some websites even use, unfortunately, very specific password criteria that makes it easier to scan. I don't know how many of y'all on Facebook follow the network security page we've got here at NSU, but I posted a thing a few days ago on it where I think it was Medicare, actually. I ought to tell him to look at that. Your password has to be exactly 8 characters, and it's got to have 1 number in it, and it's all got to be lowercase. That's a huge security risk, in my opinion, because now I know if I get my hands on that database, the passwords are all 8 characters long. So I don't look for anything lower or bigger. I look for 8-character passwords with a number in it. That cuts down the number of things you've got to do by a great deal. All right, so then we'll do a penetration test. This is where you simulate an attack on a system. There are lots of different types of these. We won't get into the details here. But generally, you normally have this done by an outside company. The reason for that is you want someone who's not familiar with the network to look at it as if they were an outside attacker. Now, that gets interesting because some attacks come from within, but basically, Your penetration test is just a simulation of what an attack would be. And your pen tester, when it's over, will give a report saying, here's what we've done, you know, here's the holes you got, here's what you need to fix. Because there are lots of different types of assessments that happen, we have something called OVAL. It's the Open Vulnerability and Assessment Language. And this is a standard to regulate the transfer of public information across networks. You can look up OVAL on the internet. OVAL is its own language, but there are pieces of this like known vulnerability analysis. There are databases out there of hashes for standard Windows files based on the version of the operating system. Just as a crazy example, that's one I can go and scan. If I think somebody's done something to my server, and I'm digging around and I think they modified HAL.dll, the hardware abstraction layer file for the server. Okay, I'm running Windows 2016 server version 1709, whatever the exact version is. I can go out here and look in these databases, and I can get the hash for the file from Microsoft. I can then run that hash against my file on my computer, and if they don't match, that tells me what? If a hash doesn't match, a file's been what? It's been modified in some way. I don't know what that modification is, but now I know for a fact the file's been modified. That necessarily doesn't even mean a vulnerability. Somebody might have patched that file for a valid reason, but it's a starting point. I now know something has happened. All right, so one of the other steps of this is a password analysis. This is where you need to recover or crack a password. Guessing. Lots of people use passwords they know. It's just the reality of the world. This is where, in CEH, I talk about dumpster diving. People use passwords named off things like their dogs or their husbands or wives or kids. There was a statistic, and I hope it's still not that bad, but at one time, 30% of people in the United States with a credit card, the PIN number to their credit card was either their birth date, their anniversary, or one of their kids' birthdays. Those are very public knowledge. Like you can go do public record searches and find all of that kind of stuff. And that's a problem, So other things that people use are dictionary words. Passwords are such a fickle thing because we want them to be secure, but if you write it down, you've screwed up my security. So a lot of the ways people try to do that is use a dictionary password. Dictionaries are even smarter now than they used to be. In the old days, we would think of a dictionary word as just words in the dictionary, but now they will substitute numbers, like they'll substitute an O and a 0 and an E and a 3, because that's what people do to try to make the password harder to guess. Finally, a brute force is where I just try every possible password combination that exists. These take forever, but if I know pieces of information, they take a lot less time. In my example earlier about, the Medicare system, if it's eight characters, I can eliminate everything else. This is a huge issue I have with Windows. If y'all have noticed in Windows, when you type your password, it puts that little dot on the screen, which means I don't see your password. But if I can get a screenshot of that, or I can catch it from a camera, I know exactly how many characters your password is. We talk about shoulder surfing. This is a good place for that. If I notice you type your password, and I notice you don't ever hit the shift key, or you never go up to the number key, and now I know your password is 9 characters, but I know it's 9 lowercase characters, that's not going to take long to crack. I can do that in 2 or 3 days because I've limited down to what it could possibly be. And then another type of attack is called a cryptanalysis attack. And this is where we use something called a rainbow table to tell what the password is from the hash. Now, a little bit of background on this, because this is the last piece of this one. The way that Windows and other operating systems, for the most part, most secure operating systems, they don't store your password as a password. What they store your password as is a hash. Now, y'all think back to where we started talking about hashes. What's one thing about a hash? I can run a hash to get a value, but what can I not do? I can't reverse it. I can't get the data back from the hash. The way this is done with a password is, okay, let's say your password's purple. All right, your Windows password's purple, which is a bad password, by the way, but we'll go with it. Your password's purple, you type it. It's better than it being on the whiteboard like it is in here. So purple, you run purple. What happens is Windows creates a hash from that password. And what's stored in Active Directory is not your password, but is the hash for the word purple. Okay, this is why when you call an admin, they say, hey, what's my password? They tell you, I have no idea. They really don't. They can't recover it. What they can do is replace it. When if I have a problem with my password and I have to call IT here to do it, they can't tell me what it is. All they can do is say, all right, I'll reset it for you. And in most cases, they reset it to something and then make you change it the first time you log in. Like, as a general rule, and this is not given a security way, this is the thing at Northwestern, if you call in and don't know your password, they'll reset it to NSU Demons for you. But when you log in, the first thing you have to do is change the password. You can't leave it NSU Demons. The first time you log in, it makes you change it. So what a rainbow table is, because of those hashes, there's no way to get the data back. There's no way I can take that hash, which is stored, and get the word purple out of it. A rainbow table is where somebody took a very long time and made a list of every possible password and what the hash combination of that password would give. So if I can break into your server and I can get your password file, I can then run it against a rainbow table, and it will tell me what your password is because the rainbow table has all the possible combinations. The problem is these tables are very, very, very large. Just in Windows, an 8-character table with nothing but lowercase letters is 60 gigabytes. So these things get huge. In fact, for the big ones, and you can generate them on your own. There are programs, Kali Linux that we use a lot. It'll generate a table for you. But the amount of time it takes to generate that table on just a PC is ridiculous. Just out of curiosity, and here one day I wanted to see, to generate an 8-character lowercase password for Windows 10 in here was going to take one of these computers 3 years. So, yeah, so we're talking a huge, now, okay, but once I have the table, running the table against the password is a matter of minutes, just the amount of time it takes the database to search. So, if you do your database searches right, it's not going to take long. Most places that use these, you end up buying them from somewhere already made. Or like there are sites on the internet where if you get the hash, you can send the hash off and pay them X amount of money, and they have these tables already built, and they're sitting in Amazon Cloud, and they'll run the search and return the results to you. Now that's something, again, I wouldn't do for my own self, but if I've gotten your data, it's probably worth 20 or 30 bucks for me to let you run that and tell me what your password is. So it's, it's a trade-off. But these tables get very, very, very large very quickly. I've seen tables on the internet, like some of the ones sitting on Amazon Cloud that you run for pay. They're 2 and 3 terabytes in size just for, small numbers of passwords. This is why the size of the password is important. If you can memorize a 15 or 20 character password that's uppercase, lowercase, and a symbol, and it's not a dictionary word, this is why you truly have a super strong password, because that is very, very hard for one of these crackers to break. But again, if you write it down, you just broke everything. So in this chapter, there's 10 true false and there's 10 multiple choice. Again, review the key topics. Look at the real-world scenarios. I know that some of the labs aren't running. There's an Nmap lab if it runs. Y'all can duplicate that on your own. I've made the CEH class do it. I'm going to suggest it again to y'all. Put Nmap on your computer and look at it. Run a scan on your network at home. Run one in here if you want. Don't run one on the campus network. You can, but I'll get in trouble. Don't do it. Unless you're going to do a passive one, and then I don't want to know you did it. Y'all have any questions?